All right, so hi everybody. So in the spirit of what Keith just said, the conclusion. The conclusion is that Wi-Fi 7 is coming. It has a few new bells and whistles, but to be perfectly honest with you, the paradigm shift has already happened, and the paradigm shift is the availability of the 6 gigahertz spectrum. Now that being said, I am going to spend some time over the next hour talking about some of the new bells and whistles and whether they'll be valuable or not. And this is a similar presentation to what I did in Phoenix back in February, but I've got a little bit of some new information and actually did a little bit of play testing with some consumer-grade Wi-Fi 7 stuff that is available now. So let me tell you about my life story. No, just kidding. You can. I do like everybody to link up with me on LinkedIn, so please do that. And the one shameless plug I will get in is that Extreme is doing a event on Thursday night. Please attend. We'll be showcasing a lot of our product. We also have this special magical wizard of Wi-Fi guest, Peter McKenzie, that will be talking about our air defense WIP solution. So please show up, and there might be some goodies as well. Now, with that, let's go ahead and start talking about Wi-Fi 7. And Wi-Fi 7, quite frankly, is dependent on something that's already been here for over 2 years now. And I can't believe it's already been 2 years, a little over 2 years in North America. And that is the availability of the 6 gigahertz frequency band. Now, as you know, here in Europe, you don't have as much frequency space as we do in Canada and in the United States and a few other countries. But that's still quite a bit. You have the whole Uni-5 band, and that's basically equivalent to what 5 gigahertz is available. And I want to remind everybody, it's a clean and pristine RF environment. It's never been used for Wi-Fi before. There's hardly any interferers in this environment as well, and there's no need for backward compatibility. So you don't have to worry about the older stuff and the protection mechanisms that have been dragging everybody down. Now that being said, I would rather you guys here in Europe have all of this. Okay, so you should be aware that there's heavy lobbying going on right now with the ERC so that we can have spectrum harmonization. We really need that to happen globally. I don't expect it to happen in every country, but we hopefully will get Europe to also come into play and get the rest of the spectrum space. We're not quite there yet. If you know anybody at any of these lobbies or any politicians, lobby them. There's a lot of lobbying going on by very big orgs for you to get the rest of the spectrum as well. And hopefully you'll get at least some more. That remains to be seen. As you also know, currently it is only in Europe and in most countries an indoor play for low power indoors. Outdoor and with standard power is not yet available yet, but that is actually very imminent in the United States. The good news is this: the client populations are growing with Wi-Fi 6E and now 7. I don't even like using those terms. I just prefer to say 6 gigahertz. This is the latest data from Intel. There's now over 2,000 client devices that have a 6 gigahertz radio in them, and there's been a big uptick in the last 6 months. There's been like 500 that have been added. Almost any laptop you can buy now, you have the option of 6 gigahertz radios. Most smartphones, finally, Apple came to the party. What we've seen with the smartphones has been on the higher end or mid-tier phones. It hasn't made its way down market yet. Hopefully that will happen soon. But the populations are growing. Dependent on the vertical, I'll be honest though, we're only seeing 5 to 10% penetration, but that will, with the advent of Wi-Fi 7, will continue to grow. This is nothing new. Client devices are always slower than the actual APs. And unfortunately, we all know that client devices, older ones, have a way of hanging around forever. There's still 802.11b devices out there. Another concept I like to talk about a lot is the consumerization of IT. And it's an old concept, basically, is that if people use the technology at home, they force the enterprise to deal with it. So I wrote a blog about this about a year ago, about this in regard to 6 gigahertz. And I truly believe the same thing will happen as mom and dad buy their kids. Think about higher education, for example. If mom and dad buy their kids smartphones for Christmas, they're going to take them to, they might start using the 6 gigahertz capability, and then they're going to take them to school, and then they'll force the universities to upgrade and use 6 gigahertz if they're not already. So that will drive that as well. And so, but let's get to Wi-Fi 7. So once again, I think we get too caught up in all these generations of Wi-Fi, especially recently. Wi-Fi 6, believe it or not, is 4 years old now, okay? And Wi-Fi 6E, the E just means extended. That just meant we brought the technology to 6 gigahertz. And when will Wi-Fi 7 happen? Well, it depends on what your perception of when Wi-Fi 7 is. There is already consumer-grade stuff out there available. I made a prediction back in February that you'd be able to buy this by May. Well, I was off by a couple of months, but you can go to the store right now and buy Wi-Fi 7 home consumer-grade stuff. Now, that being said, there is no Wi-Fi 7 certification from the Wi-Fi Alliance for interoperability testing yet. I'm under embargo to say when that's going to happen. I'll just say it's soon, okay? It is soon, and the next question you're going to ask me is, when is enterprise stuff? Well, there's already one vendor that's in this room that has announced their Wi-Fi 7 AP, Jim. And then, of course, expect pretty much every other vendor to announce enterprise stuff before the end of the year, and then over the year, depending on different periods of 2024, you'll see stuff becoming for general availability and shipping. Some vendors use QCA. You'll see that stuff probably first. Vendors like Extreme, we use Broadcom. You'll see that probably a little bit later, but you will see Wi-Fi 7 enterprise equipment in 2024. Now, that being said, guess what? There's already clients. I ordered this. It's waiting for me in my house in Blue Ridge, Georgia. All right, we have a Wi-Fi 7 client in the room. Woo! All right. How's it working, man? It's awesome, right? So I have not been able to test this, but I did buy, there's another one out too. It's by a company called, it's a Chinese company called OnePlus. It's called the OnePlus 11. And so I played with it a little bit last week. Okay, and I'll show you a few things. But so I know of right now 3 Wi-Fi 7 clients, 2 Chinese phones, and then the Google Pixel 8 and 8 Pro. So hopefully more. What? Okay, all right, but more are coming, okay? That being said, I do not expect a lot of Wi-Fi 7 clients. It's going to take time. Okay, but it'll take time, but 2024, same thing. And then let's get out of this whole talk about Wi-Fi 7 and Wi-Fi 6E. Let's say 6 gigahertz. That being said, my presentation's about Wi-Fi 7, and it is based on the 802.11be draft amendment, extremely high throughput that adds all these new bells and whistles. So we're back to speeds and feeds, extremely high throughput. I think the next one's going to be called ludicrous high throughput, okay? But right now we're on an extremely high throughput, and you may have seen some demos. This one was done a year ago between Intel and Broadcom. There was another one that QCA did, and they showed in this particular demo a wireless link that had 5 gigabits per second of throughput. Okay? Sounds fantastic, right? QCA did a similar one. As a matter of fact, theoretically, you can get 33 gigabits per second now. Yeah, but how many of you, raise your hand if you think we're going to get that. Raise your hand if you think we're going to get half that. Okay. Now, the 5 gigabits per second, it could be doable with mesh, okay? When we start talking about client to AP capabilities, I'm very skeptical, except under controlled conditions like these demos. That being said, let's talk about it a little bit more. Let's talk about the features that are going to be in Wi-Fi 7. So number one, I view a lot of these features, quite frankly, as more consumer-grade features. Here's the first one, a 320 megahertz channel. That is pretty awesome. Now, the more the frequency space, the more the throughput you're going to get, right? Pretty awesome, right? But you know what? And by the way, where these channels are positioned depends on the country and region you're in. But let me ask you this. Currently in Europe, how many 320 megahertz channels do you get? You get a whopping 1, okay? So that's really scalable in the enterprise. Now, the good news is I bought one of those consumer-grade home routers thinking that the default setting was going to be 320 megahertz. And I turned it on, and I turned on Wi-Fi Explorer. And by the way, is Adrian here? Dude, you're a stud, man. Wi-Fi 7 capabilities already in his app, man. Way to go, Adrian. So, yeah, you can clap. But by the way, Wi-Fi 7, turned it on, and I was very happy to see it was only 160 megahertz channel by default. Okay, which, you think you're going to use that in the enterprise? No. Now, so I was pretty happy that they wasn't using 320 megahertz channels, but I continued to watch my Wi-Fi Explorer 3, and all of a sudden this happened. It just flashed like that and stayed that way for a few seconds, and then it went away, okay? And first of all, look where the primary channel is on this 320 megahertz channel, so which is just crazy. And then why did this happen? Well, I'll talk about that a little bit later about why I figured out why this happened. So it was using a 320 megahertz channel, but we'll come back to that. Okay, the problem with these large channels, the 160s and the 320s, and I've talked about this in previous presentations, is if any consumer-grade stuff is deployed near your enterprise, where you're going to be deploying 40 or 80, it's going to guaranteed pretty much to cause OBSS interference, where primary channels are stepping on secondary channels, and your throughput will go down like this. Now, I do not have time to get into a deep discussion about what causes that problem, but if this happens, trust me, your throughput will tank. You can go on to the YouTube channel or WLPC's website where I've talked about this before, and I also have a couple of blogs that go into great detail discussing this problem going all the way back into the early days of 802.11n, but persist now even more as we move into 6 gigahertz if you're using these wide channels. So that is a worry. If consumer-grade stuff is turned on nearby, it's going to cause problems. And the one thing that you'll learn in this industry, I mean, how many people think that the enterprise side of Wi-Fi is a bigger business than the consumer side? Good, because it isn't. The consumer business's Wi-Fi is much bigger industry than the enterprise business that most of us are in. But that being said, they very often have different goals. And that's why you see them marketing things like 320 megahertz channels and things like this, 4K QAM. Okay, so 4K QAM is the other next wonderful feature that's going to give us ludicrous high throughput by using very intense modulation encoding schemes. It'll work, and as a matter of fact, I've already determined that the home routers and that 11 plus phone that I have does support the 4K QAM. But you need a pristine RF environment. You're going to need an SNR probably of about 42 dB, and you're going to probably only work on 6 gigahertz to have that kind of RF environment, and you're going to have to be very, very close to the AP. So it'll work, but I mean, just know, and I'll tell you, when I connected my smartphone with my consumer-grade router, I was seeing data rates of 5096 or something like this. I believe somebody's doing a presentation about Wi-Fi 7 data rates. I'm interested in seeing that. But bottom line is, I did see that data rate. Fortunately, didn't have any time to do any throughput testing, but I was also 5 feet away from the actual router. So I'm pretty sure the 4K QAM was working. Now, the one feature that will have some consumer grade benefits, but also possibly in the future some benefits in the enterprise is multi-link operation. And this is the one you're going to hear a lot about. Think multiple bands and multiple channels, where a Wi-Fi 7 client could actually connect to, say, maybe an 80 megahertz channel on 6 gigahertz and a 40 megahertz channel and 5 gigahertz at the same time. Or it could be two 5 gigahertz channels, or it could be two 6, or it could be a combination of 2, 5, and 6. Now, there's different use case. There's some terminology I'm going to throw out here real quick. You're going to start hearing this terminology. If you hear MLD, that just means multi-link device. And there's different kinds of multi-link device, single radios and it gets corrupted. So what? You have duplicates of it, and that guarantees the reliability. The one that I think will definitely see support, will absolutely see support for on both the AP and the client side eventually, and I have a little bit of hope for, is the link steering. So imagine a 2x2 client listening with one radio chain on 5 gigahertz and another radio chain on 6 gigahertz, and whichever band becomes available first, it then transmit on that band and that channel as a 2x2. So, and that could be potentially on a per packet basis. And that will absolutely have an enhancement of latency. So a lot of the use cases you hear for this especially are latency-intensive applications like AR and VR, which will start growing in both the consumer and enterprise markets over the next 10 years, is my true belief. And also this will actually potentially give you a little bit better throughput too, but it's more about the latency component. Now there is some new things, so let's talk about a little bit more on the technical side. So there is a 2 MACs now to actually allow this to happen. There's a lower layer MAC and there's an upper layer MAC. So we all know that Wi-Fi works at layer 1 and layer 2. The lower MAC is everything that we've done before, okay? And that's where that's where roaming mechanisms take place, security mechanisms take place, so on and so on. Pretty much everything that Peter McKenzie teaches you about, that's going on right here on the lower MAC, and the MAC addresses are representative of the radios in your APs and your client devices. But there's also an upper MAC that is link agnostic, and it is to represent the fact that there is what is known as a multi-link operation association. And it actually has a MAC address. It's a unique identifier to identify the fact that you're actually transmitting on 2 different channels. And that is actually used to communicate up to the higher layers. And you can actually see it. So once again, here's Wi-Fi Explorer 3 right here, and you can actually see that there is an MLD MAC address that is displayed. That is not the radios, that is the MAC address that is representative of the MLO association and link between maybe 2 or 3 channels, and that is used to communicate to the higher layers. Okay? There are new information elements. Surprise, surprise. There is a multi-link element. There's also EHT elements for extremely high throughput. But the multi-link element is mainly used for a association and discovery process between a client and an AP if they're going to set up some sort of multi-link operation capability, whatever it may be. And they basically exchange that MLD address between them, as well as some of their other capabilities in the normal process that we know about. So maybe in the association request, it is sharing, the client sharing its MLD address as well as some of its MLO capabilities, and then the AP will respond accordingly with its higher layer, its upper layer MAC MLD address, as well as its whatever MLO capabilities it's using. You know why this is cool, and this is for us Wi-Fi geeks, is I'm pretty sure everybody in this room, or most of you, understands the four-way handshake. One of the seeds for the four-way handshake are the MAC addresses of the radios. Now the seed for the four-way handshake is this MLD address, these 2 MLD address. And why that's cool is it allows you to use the same dynamic encryption keys that are created when you're switching between bands. So think about it now. If you're doing like inter-band roaming right now, every time you roam from 5 to 6 or 6 to 2 or whatever, you would be doing a new four-way handshake each time. But with this capability, once you establish that MLO association, you see the four-way handshake and you're good to go, and you don't have to do a four-way handshake as you're moving between the bands or using the bands at the same time. So that's pretty cool. Now, there's 4 different kinds of, there's 4 different kinds of MLO operation. I'm only going to focus on 2. Here's the one that I'm pretty sure, I know for a fact, will be required on both the client side and the AP side, and that's enhanced multi-link single radio. That is the steering capability that I spoke of before. So the listening on, the listening on both bands and then transmitting on one band and going back and forth on a per packet basis. So have some confidence to this. It actually, when they do the switch between the channels, there will be like a process using some sort of trigger frame, like a multi-user RTS to trigger that, and then there's a little bit of a teeny switch delay between it, but then when it goes to where you see the PPDU, that's when it's transmitting, like, for example, with all its radio chains on the one channel, okay? Now, the one that you're going to see hype, though, is called the simultaneous transmit receive multi-link multi-radio, another acronym. This is the aggregation. And you're going to see it hyped a lot because, the amazing throughput you're going to get with it. The problem is pretty much all vendors and chipset vendors will tell you right now, we don't have much hope for it on the client side because, and don't expect support on the client side or for it to work. Let me put it that way. The problem is simply this, and I think some of you have heard this before. The fact is that there's a certain period of time where you have to be synchronized, and it's a window of time. So which band in this example do you think would be available first, the 5 or the 6? The 6. So maybe the 6 becomes available, but now you're waiting for the 5 to be available so you can aggregate your data. The problem is the wait time, even though we're talking about microseconds, it becomes too long. And there's already been a lot of studies that show that wait time is actually detrimental and your throughput will go down. So don't have much hope for this. However, here's what I do have hope for, is this. Using this technology for mesh links. I fully expect the consumer grade companies to use this maybe by default for their backhaul for when they sell like the 3 devices as a kit. And I also expect enterprise companies to do things as well with this. So imagine you had an MLO mesh. It could be on 2 6 gigahertz channels, or 2 5, or a 5 and a 6. And you remove those channels from your channel reuse pattern and just dedicated them for mesh. This should work. It should work. So I believe this could be a potentially real good use case. And I know for a fact some of the consumer companies, this is the number one use case that they have identified. Okay? Now, there's some things you need to think about, though, with MLO. And that is things change in your network. So things change in your network. So think about this. Think if you have a 5 and a 6 MLO association between a client and an AP, and then there is a channel switch announcement from the AP, and then the channel just moved, okay, on 5 gigahertz. That's not good. What happened to your MLO link? Okay, you just lost one of your channels. What about RRM? RRM might just decide to change one of your channels, and one of those channels might have been part of your MLO association. Then you just lost one of the channels of your MLO association. Now, and by the way, I believe in some of the channel switch announcements, there's going to be some new MLO fields. I haven't really dug into it yet, but we'll see. That being said, there are some methods that are being defined. Is either, I think most of these are going to be required and some optional. It just depends on what side of the link you're on, to deal with the scenarios I just talked about. And you'll hear it called multi-link reconfiguration, or sometimes called AP removal. And here's just 2 other scenarios. So similar to what I just talked about, where one of the links goes down. So what if you had an AP and one of its radios went into like a client mode where it goes and associates to another APs? Various vendors have capabilities like that. Well, the link between the AP and the client, then it just lost one of its links for its MLO association. Another example would be, and then the link just goes down. Another example would be this. What if one of your radios on the AP went into like a sniffing mode for a packet capture? And if it was doing that, that just terminated one of the channels of your MLO link, and it's down. So you basically have 2 choices. The client could just break the link entirely and reassociate. Or what if you could just keep the MLO association open, but had a way for the AP to tell the client, yeah, one of the channels is gone, but just keep your association gone. Don't do another reassociation. Don't do a 4-way handshake, and just continue on the one channel. And there is methods to do that using action frames and other capabilities, and that's called multi-link reconfiguration, or AP removal. So it'll just keep things a little more seamless and with less interruption to your applications. There are other things you're going to have to think about with MLO, and that's power save mechanisms. They're all going to have to be link aware. So if you're using MLO, which by default probably will not be on by default, it will be up to you to whether you turn it on your APs, on the AP side anyway. But if you are using it, whatever form of power-saving mechanisms the clients are using, whether it's TIM, DTIMs, or target wait times, there's going to be methods defined in the standards so that they are link-aware, okay? Now, let me just tell you what a little bit of playtime I did last week. So to be honest with you, I haven't had a chance to do a lot of testing yet. I imagine some of you, like Adrian and others, have already done more testing than me. I'll be playing with my own enterprise gear very soon as well. But like I said, clients just came out, and there's a handful of consumers, so I did a little playtime, some basic playtime, and I turned on one of the consumer-grade devices, okay? So a Wi-Fi router. It was 2. It was a TP-Link, and I turned on 2 of them. And I configured a SSID called Wi-Fi test, okay? Now, I was happy about that because in a minute we're going to talk about security. Towards the end of the presentation, we're going to talk about security. And what I was happy is, what it did is it automatically created an SSID called Wi-Fi test on 5 gigahertz using WPA2, and it created another SSID, a unique SSID on 6 gigahertz with a different name using WPA3. And there's a reason for this. Because there's a reason to probably use different levels of security on the different bands, and I was impressed that they did that, okay? Now, what was not on by default was MLO. So I turned it on, and that came on, okay? And that came on, and I had to turn it on. Now, you'll note it's the same SSID, and it is using WPA3 on both bands. Because if you're using 6 gigahertz of any kind of MLO association you have, if 6 gigahertz is one of the channels, you are going to be forced to use WPA3 because there is no WPA2 in 6 gigahertz. So you'll notice that you're forced to use WPA3 here. You'll also notice by default that these things set up a mesh backhaul between them as well. Oh, and by the way, look at the default settings. Okay, 160 megahertz, right? The default settings, but it did set up a mesh backhaul SSID on the same channel. And then, by the way, you can see, look what it did. And this is the MLO SSID. Look what it did. It used 160 megahertz, not only in 6 gigahertz, but also in 5. Wonderful. And then the positioning of your primary channel right here is kind of weird. Or the positioning of the whole channel right here is a little bit weird. And I did do a packet capture. And there was the multi-link discovery and setup. First of all, the beacons are on 5 gigahertz. It has the R&R information in 5 gigahertz, as well as the other MLO fields are in the beacons and probes on 5 gigahertz. But the discovery process I captured on 6 gigahertz between my OnePlus phone and the D-Link. And basically, just to show you very simplistic what happened during the authentication process, this is the authentication request. That's the phone sharing its MLD address. That is the AP returning back with its MLD address to say, yeah, let's go ahead and set up an association. Now, what was interesting, though, is, by the way, what it was using was EMLSR. So it was the steering. It was the steering capability that it was trying to set up. And if you look at, this is the association response frame that is coming from the TP-Link, and it's showing that it is using EMLSR. But when I looked at the association request, it was not showing that from the client. So I don't even know if the client driver on the phone even supports it yet. And I just, quite frankly, didn't have enough time to delve into it to see if it was actually working or not. That'll be future tests. And that also goes to another point you should know. Whenever we have first edition clients and drivers and new technology, drivers take a while to catch up. I think we all know that. So bottom line is, I was happy to see that EMLR was supported on the AP. I couldn't prove that it was supported on the client or working, for that matter. And the other thing that I was a little disappointed about too is the mesh backhaul. It was not using MLO. Okay, it was just set up on its own. So I was expecting the mesh backhaul to use the aggregation, but it wasn't. Now I know for a fact that some of these consumer vendors are trying to do that, because I have friends at a very big consumer grade company that used to work at Aerohive that are experimenting with it right now as we speak. And quite frankly, they're getting mixed results, okay? But they hope to make that a big use case for, and maybe use the MLO aggregation as a default capability for any mesh setup if you turn that on. but it's not there yet. So you can see it's very early days with this technology. Now, remember the 320 megahertz channel that popped up magically on Wi-Fi Explorer 3? Well, I finally figured out what it was. It was the mesh. It kept, when traffic was being sent over the mesh backhaul, it was flipping between 160 and 320 and then doing this. So, and I dug into the frames and you could see support for the 320 megahertz channel right there. So, woohoo, 320 megahertz, okay? I'm sure we'll all be using that in the enterprise. That being said, that's Wi-Fi 7, okay? 320 megahertz and 4K QAM MLO. So there's some other capabilities. Yes, sir?
What do you use to capture that?
To capture that, Wireshark. Good question. What did I use to capture that? I used AirTool on my Mac Mini, and then you can display this. If you get like the developer version of Wireshark, you'll be able to see this. Or, you know,
What radio collective is it? No.
it was just a standard 6 gigahertz radio. Okay, I see your question. It was a standard 6 gigahertz radio, Wi-Fi 6E radio in my Mac Mini that I used to do the capture. So I was not doing a capture with a Wi-Fi 7 device, if that was the question. So not there yet, okay? Not there yet. So, but I was able to get most of what I wanted to see, most of what I wanted to see. And
not capturing the data, actually. You are just seeing the channel width, right?
Well, no, I mean, I was able to see the frames, especially the management and control frames.
Not the full bit frame.
Well, I was not seeing like I couldn't prove that the EML SSR was working, and I couldn't see the data frames. So you are correct. So that is correct. But that being said, that is correct. And by the way, you can use the developer version of Wireshark to see all this, or just use Adrian's. Wi-Fi Explorer 3. 90% of what you need to see is right there. So, but if you want to dig deeper and deeper, Packer has the developer version of Wireshark is starting to decode a bunch of things. Some more Wi-Fi 7 thoughts. OFDMA. I've had conversations with several of you privately. Sort of works, in the legacy bands, you might see a 5% enhancement in capabilities and throughput and performance. We're doing a little bit of testing where we think it's going to thrive better in 6 gigahertz, mainly because you don't have the backward compatibility. That being said, there are some enhancements to OFDMA on how it deals with the resource units in Wi-Fi 7. And it's called multi-RU, and there's two kinds called small MRUs and large MRUs. Small MRUs have to be contiguous and contained in a 20 megahertz channel. The purpose is that one of the things that was happening in OFDMA is some of the space in the RUs in a channel just wasn't being used. So it wasn't being filled up. And so they figured out a way to make it more efficient by using smaller contiguous multi-user resource units called small RUs that are contiguous within 28 megahertz channels. There's also something called large MRUs, multiple resource units, that can be of different sizes as well. Much like here, they're of different sizes, but this can also be of different sizes, and if they're of different sizes, they don't have to be contiguous. And it's meant for larger channels, like 160 megahertz, 320 and 80 megahertz channels. The main use case for this is it's tied to what's called preamble puncturing. So think if you have some sort of interferer, you can basically puncture a hole within your channel and still not have to take out your whole channel during medium contention and still use the rest of that channel and allow that interferer just to transmit here, and you won't transmit data in that channel. This was optional in Wi-Fi 6, but nobody adopted it. It's going to be required in Wi-Fi 7. The use case that you hear it touted about a lot for is this could be used in conjunction with AFC and standard power. I'm skeptical a little bit about this because it's probably going to also require the cooperation of the AFC providers, and it's still early days, okay? We're just now standing up the AFC stuff in North America. But it does have, but I still have a little bit of hope for this for just standard OBSS interference, okay? But I never believe anything till it's field tested. So, and I think there's a lot of people the same thing. But this is getting touted a lot. Talk to my friend Jim. He seems to think that this is going to be a great feature moving forward. But we'll see, you know. I do expect other things. I expect resurgence of like dual 5 modes and SDR modes as we move into Wi-Fi 6E and 7 more. So think about it this, the client populations are still growing with 6 gigahertz. So you could deploy like a dual 5 gigahertz AP. And as your client populations grow, switch one of those radios over to 6 gigahertz. You may even see dual 6 from a few vendors coming up. So I do expect some of those various SDR modes to grow. Will Wi-Fi 6E and 7 features thrive in 6 gigahertz? Well, this kind of goes to what I was talking about before with OFDMA. You will, you know, we think we're starting to see a little bit of data that's doing better in 6 gigahertz than the legacy bands. There's enhancements for uplink OFDMA as well. Okay, and then, of course, our old friend multi-user MIMO. One chipset vendor in particular loves to tout about multi-user MIMO, especially uplink multi-user MIMO. How well do you guys think that's going to work in this room right here? But you will hear lots. There's one particular chipset vendor that claims that it will cure cancer. And by the way, you may even hear talk of 16 by 16 by 16 APs. If anybody builds that, shame on them, okay? You know, to be honest with you, it has some new bells and whistles, okay? It's exciting, some new bells and whistles. I see some potential for MLO, but once again, I'll go back to my original statement. I'm more still excited about the spectrum availability. And I'm gonna talk a little bit more about that here in a few minutes. Do you know what I'm more interested in? I'm more interested in what's coming in about 4 or 5 years, okay? Now, I don't know if I'll still be around in 4 or 5 years. I'll probably be retired or semi-retired. And if Keith still has a convention, I'll probably still come to it as, won't be a speaker anymore. I'll just sit in the back and let the young kids talk. But that being said, this technology was first defined as part of Wi-Fi 7. It's being pushed back into the next version of Wi-Fi that they're probably going to call Wi-Fi 8. It's not multi-link operation, it's multiple AP operation. So think about a client communicating in some sort of distributed architecture with multiple APs at the same time. And there's 3 different MAC methods that are being defined and 2 PHY methods. Why I'm very intrigued by this is 15, 16 years ago, I left a very lucrative private business and company that I owned to go to work for a company called Aerohive that had a disruptive architecture, distributed architecture that moved the control plane down to the edge. And they were the first to do it. Now, pretty much every vendor has some sort of option like that now. I think this could be disruptive as well because you're taking that kind of control plane distributed architecture and now including the client. So that intrigues me, whether it works or not, we'll see, but I'm very interested in this. And so maybe in 5 years from now, one of you will be demoing it for us up here on stage. I hope so. Won't be me. Now, let's get into some design considerations. Most of this is review, but a little bit more from a Wi-Fi 7 perspective as well. So real-world stuff. Number one, in Europe, you only have 40 megahertz design capability, okay? Right now, you have basically 12 channels available that you could use in a reuse pattern for 40 megahertz. And I'm gonna recommend you do that as opposed to the 20. And you'll probably, the odds of your CCI are greatly reduced with a 12 channel plan. You could use 80, but you only have 6 channels. I think it's 6. Is that right? I think it's 6. Yeah, 6. 12 divided by 2. So you'd have 6 channels, but yeah, you're probably going to increase your odds of CCI. Now, if you get more frequency space, and we hope that's happening, you have 14. If you can get all 12 megahertz of frequency space here in Europe, I mean, this is the default setting actually on our AP, and almost every vendor's AP, enterprise vendor's AP in North America, is to use the 80 megahertz channels in a reuse pattern. It's actually, I'm not going to get into this because it's been talked about in other sessions, but it's actually, believe it or not, advantageous to use the wider channels moving forward because you can actually increase your power as well, and it offsets some of the losses in SNR due to the gains in the noise floor, used due to something called power spectral density. So definitely, 80 and 40, depending on how much spectrum space that you have available to you. And of course, the bigger the channel, the more data you'll be able to transmit. The other thing, I didn't put the slide up here too, but I probably should have, is the whole range discussion as well. The 6 gigahertz, different people and different vendors will, there's like one vendor in particular is telling everybody that you can do one-to-one replacements with a, I don't necessarily buy into that philosophy. One-to-one replacements traditionally have never been a good idea. So for all the vendors in here that offer predictive modeling tools, I highly recommend that you use those and then validate it, because even though it's only a 2 dB difference in free space path loss between a 5 and a 6 gigahertz channel, if you have rooms with very thick walls, I can tell you right now, your effective range for 6 gigahertz is just not going to be the same as 5 gigahertz. So, if you have an AP in every room, the deployment strategy that Keith likes, you can do a one-to-one replacement. But it's always, what have we all preached in this whole room here? Design, 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 and validate. Okay. So understand that the effective range is going to be smaller due to the laws of physics, okay? And then you got to think about wired networks. So there's this. Will we finally need multi-gig? All right, so most of you guys are going to start throwing eggs at me now because how long have we had this conversation now? 10 years maybe? And the switching vendors have been trying to tell you that you need 2 cables or multi-gig cables now for 10 years. And other than corner cases, it hasn't really transpired. And so the thinking, though, is now with Wi-Fi 6E and with Wi-Fi 7, with the multi-link operation, you got 3 bands, 3 radios, 1 gig's not going to be enough. And you got some people saying that you need 10 gig uplinks. Okay, I didn't say that, but yes. By the way, you got some people saying that you're going to need fiber uplinks. Okay, fiber uplinks. And don't laugh. The consumer-grade stuff are putting the ports on there. Okay? And you hear a lot of this, too. It's also driven by the hype on the consumer side and all these initiatives by all these telcos to try to get multi-gig speeds into the backhaul, into homes. There's a lot of initiatives by companies like Comcast and others to do that. Will you need fiber? Absolutely not. Will you need 10 gig uplinks? No. But I will say this. I have no problem with you starting to think finally to upgrading your switches to 2.4 or 5. The costs have come down. It's pretty standard tech now. Every AP is going to have either a minimum of a 2.5 gig port or a 5 gig port. And think about the mesh capability of 2 APs. And if you have mesh backhaul and you're getting 4 or 5 gigs of throughput on the wireless side, okay, 1 gig's not going to be enough anymore. So with Wi-Fi 7, if you're using mesh in particular. So I see no point in delaying this anymore at a minimum for future proofing. Okay? I'm not going to say that you have to do it tomorrow, but we've had this discussion a million times, but it's looking like it's going beyond corner cases finally. Okay? The more important discussion is still PoE. Okay? you're going to need, for whether it's 6E or 7, if it's 2x2x2s, you're going to need AT power for full functionality. The days of 15 watts are over, okay? And if you're using 4x4x4s or even 4x4x5s in that typo I have right there, you can, for full functionality, you're going to need, of the AP, you're going to need BT power. Now, every vendor has various types of downgrade capabilities where the 4x4s might work on PoE+. Maybe you disable radio chains, maybe you disable BLE radio, the extra Ethernet port. Every vendor does it differently on different models, okay? But there's more power. And you know what's interesting about this, and two things about this. Number one, where I'm concerned about this, if you start doing one-to-one replacements, people aren't going to be thinking about their PoE budgets, and that little animation that you've seen in my slide before of the AP rotating is an AP rebooting. That is the number one support call most enterprise vendors get, is that AP start randomly rebooting because they're not getting enough power. And guys, especially over here in Europe, PoE is not just used for access points. It's used for smart lighting. It's used for all kinds of things. So paying attention to your power budgets is going to be more important than ever. And you know what's interesting, think about this as well, is especially here in Europe, there's a whole drive towards sustainability in IT, right? And keeping power, conserving power and watching your power, right? And you will see vendors like Extreme and others that will offer features and capabilities to maybe start conserving the power and giving you visibility and kilowatt hours and dollars saved. There's even mandates for that in Europe. But at the end of the day, we're building APs with more radios that need more power. So it's like kind of counter to the two goals that we have here. So just be aware of that. There's lots of good tools out there that can already have do 6 gigahertz design and validation. And you can read the blog about that. A lot of those vendors are here in the room. I do want to challenge everybody to rethink design in 6 gigahertz, whether it's Wi-Fi 6E or 7. I don't even, my own sales team, guys, I've trained my own sales team not even to say 6E or 7. I say, don't say 6E, don't say 7, say 6 gigahertz. That's the value. And rethink what you can do in 6 gigahertz. Understand that you can only use WPA3 there. You might have different SSID strategies. You might do more segmentation. I'm more and more of a believer that maybe putting the bandwidth intensive or mission critical applications on 6 gigahertz with a separate SSID and just taking them off 5 is the way to go. And the more and more I think about it, I'm actually recommending, do you really want to put guest traffic on 6 gigahertz? I know people will do it, but I'm struggling to understand why you'd want to put guest traffic on 6 gigahertz. Okay, there's always corner cases and reasons why, but I'm struggling to understand why you'd want to do that. And the last really thing I need to talk about is the security. So I've talked about this before, but I got to talk about it from a Wi-Fi 7 perspective as well. So there is no more WPA2 in 6 gigahertz. It's WPA3, either personal, which uses SAE, or WPA3 enterprise, which uses the management frame protection, and or you can use OWE, which I'm not a fan of. So you have to use it. You have no choice, okay? And by the way, Wi-Fi 7 is also going to mandate, you don't have to turn this on, but it's going to mandate support for 192-bit, which was optional in Wi-Fi 6E, but it'll be mandated support, but it will not be on by default. But the problem with WPA3 is that it's been around for 4 years, right? And once again, let's just see the show of hands. How many people are using WPA? And Jennifer will probably be talking about this, but how many people are using WPA3 in the legacy bands? Okay, that's a higher number than I expected. Are you using the transition modes? Yes. And what's your level of success with that? Okay, all right. Transition modes are usually not a good thing. The problem with the transition mode, even with the transition modes allow for backward compatibility, so you can support WPA3 and WPA2 at the same time. And we may have to do that for things like the edge Jerome SSID, for example, or there's alternative workarounds for that as well. But at the end of the day, probably the guidance that we're giving a lot of customers, unless they can fully control their client populations, is use different levels of security on the different bands, unless you can have success with the transition modes. And I know some of our customers are starting to have a little bit of success with the transition modes. Just understand that the drivers of some of the legacy clients just might go, because they just don't like the new information elements. Okay, so just understand that. And by the way, I should have removed that. Don't put guest traffic on 6 gigahertz. So I didn't fix my slide on time. So bottom line, the guidance right now is maybe different levels, different SSIDs and different levels of securities by band. So that gets complicated when you talk about things like edge Jerome. But that being said, this is probably what you'll see a lot of people do unless you're using the transition modes. But it gets more complicated with Wi-Fi 7. If you're using an MLO SSID, remember the slide I showed you before with the MLO SSID? And it had a 5 gigahertz and a 6 gigahertz, and what level of security did you have to use? You had to use WPA3. So think about this. You may have to have separate MLO SSIDs for basically just for your Wi-Fi 7 clients, although the Wi-Fi older clients may or may not connect to it. But bottom line is you're going to be mandated to use WPA3 on the MLO SSIDs if you enable them on your enterprise APs. So keep that in mind. And so it just makes things even more complex. I have a feeling as Wi-Fi 7 comes out, people will start experimenting with MLO. How much they use it remains to be seen, especially on for client connectivity. For mesh, I can see it, but it's early days. And by the way, as usual, I reserve the right to be completely wrong about everything I've said up here because I've been wrong before. So in a year, we might all be, some of you might come and present and say, everything Coleman said was wrong, here's the real way it works. But we have an opportunity to learn about it as these products start finding their way to us over the coming year. I want to remind everybody that there's an event Thursday night. This is Mike Lane. He's one of our SEs. He's the Santa Claus of Wi-Fi. He will be giving away 20 Wi-Fi 6E APs at the event. But you must be at the event, much like you have to be here in the room to get the prizes here in the room. So please come. I didn't finish this slide, but I'll use it anyway. So I've been using this analogy for a while. So I keep getting asked, well, I'll just wait for Wi-Fi 7. And you know what I usually say? Why don't you just wait for Wi-Fi 8? It's coming in 4 years. Well, what do you mean? Wi-Fi 7 is coming next year or a year. We've always had this problem. This is in any kind of technology. Just like cars and trucks. Okay, I bought a Dodge Ram truck a couple years ago, and the very next day there was the new next year's model was on the showroom. Okay, and it had some new bells and whistles. So the analogy I'm using with Wi-Fi 6E versus 7 is simply this: the paradigm shift was the 6 gigahertz. Okay, so think about this: I bought a truck, and the truck had access to a super highway that nobody else really had access to, the 6 gigahertz road. And it was clean and free, and it was like an express lane that only me and a few other people had access to, okay? And I've had that truck for 2 years. Now, there's some new trucks coming out, the Wi-Fi 7 trucks, and it might have some new lane assist technology and some other new bells and whistles that you can turn on. But at the end of the day, the value is what? The Wi-Fi 7 truck, has that same exclusive 6 gigahertz super highway where all the value is. And it's really been the true paradigm shift. We've gone through multiple paradigm shifts in Wi-Fi. When we went from 802.11G to 802.11N, that was a technology paradigm shift. That's when we went from SISO to MIMO. That was a big deal. We saw noticeable changes. I've had some private conversations with a lot of you. Sure, we've had new technologies evolve over the last couple of years, but the technologies have added a little bit, but not near as much as the paradigm shift we've been talking about the last couple of years is 6 gigahertz. And we're just getting started. And I really, really, truly believe, and by the way, it's not just me, all of my the Extreme's competitors are saying the same thing. We really, really believe that there's a lot of value in 6 gigahertz. I think I've gone overtime. Have I? Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. So I have 2 slides. It's not the features, guys. It's the spectrum. All future generations of Wi-Fi, 6E, 7, 8, 9, are going to be built on 6 gigahertz. Thank you very much. I apologize for going over time. Thank you.